It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. Hope all you U of L fans are getting along well with the basketball team and the women's basketball team as we go head towards the NCAA tournament and postseason play. But this show is about things going on the academic side and the research side at the university, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So on the show, he's a U of L political science professor who's writing a book about African-American politics and has done research on the differences and similarities between the civil rights movement of the 60s and Black Lives Matter movement of today. So we will be talking with Dewey Clayton. But first, he's a well-known heart surgeon, but also one of the founders of UofL's Cardiovascular Innovation Institute, CII, as those of us at U of L call it. He's Dr. Laman Gray, the endowed chair in cardiothoracic surgery at U of L. He's here to talk about what's going on at the CII and heart research. Laman, it's always good to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
How you been? You're still standing, still wandering around, aren't you?
I'm still doing great. I still enjoy what I'm doing.
Well,
Absolutely.
good. We should point out to folks that who may recognize your name but don't exactly know who you are that you did the first open heart surgery in Kentucky. And what year was that?
It wasn't quite the first open heart surgery.
Well, it was the first transplant, I guess,
did
right?
First heart transplant in Kentucky. Golly Moses, that was back in 84, I think it was, 83. No, 83 it was.
Yeah, I remember being a young reporter and doing stories on that.
Yeah, it was an exciting time. I'll never forget that.
That was kind of cool. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But first of all, I want you to talk a little bit about what is CII? What is the Cardiovascular Innovation Institute? Well,
the Cardiovascular Innovation Institute is a institute that we set up in about 10 years ago or so. And really, the basis was we had a very large surgery program at Louisville as part of the university, one at Jewish Hospital. And we wanted to expand the research program. So it originally started with some conversations that I had with Hank Wagner, who was the CEO at Jewish Hospital. And we wanted to start to really improve the academic aspect. And Hank said that Jewish Hospital would be willing to put in $20 million into a research institute. So the two of us went to talk to Jim Ramsey, who thought it was a really good idea. And that's really the very beginning.
That's how CII was born, huh?
That's how it was born.
So what do you do there? What do you do at the CII these days?
Well, we do cardiovascular research. And so let me sort of give you the basis of it. The basis of it is we wanted to do translational research. Now, what we mean by translational research is research that has a clinical problem. So I am a surgeon, not a basic researcher, so when we have a problem that we need to try to solve, we want to work with the basic scientists, the PhDs, and the other physicians, trying to get a solution to the problem. So that's what the basic concept of it is. It's a translational research. So we take the real problems we have, try to find solutions, and then move it into the clinical reality.
And get it into the bedside, into patients.
Absolutely.
How to help patients. So what are some of the things the CII, Cardiovascular Innovation Institute at UofL is working on right now? What are some of the problems you're trying to solve?
Well, okay, we're still working with trying to improve what we call ventricular assist devices in the total artificial hearts, which is really what my expertise is in. Mm-hmm. But there are other areas that I think are very, very exciting, and we're doing a lot of, I would call it stem cell research. And let me give you...
Is this Dr. Roberto Boli? Does he work with you guys?
Roberto works with us, too.
Okay.
We all work together. It's a very good team that works all together, absolutely. And to give you an example of what we're trying to do is when somebody has a heart attack, the heart muscle actually dies and becomes weak. And this is what people could die from, or they can go into heart failure from. So we're trying to develop cell-based techniques to strengthen the heart and to make it regrow, and so that we won't have to use these artificial hearts or stuff like that, trying to make the native heart stronger again.
And this is one of the most amazing things that I've discovered since I've worked at the University of Louisville and been doing stories on stuff going on at UofL, is this ability apparently it's working in some patients at least, to take what's left of the good heart tissue, take it out and regenerate it and basically insert it back into the heart to grow brand new good heart tissue to replace the stuff that's been damaged by a heart attack, right?
That's exactly what we're working on in the lab.
And that's unbelievable. I mean, and you got some patients that it's actually worked in. I know
It
Mike
has,
Mike
but
Jim.
it's, I'll be honest, it's harder than you think.
Well, it sounds super easy.
It isn't. It's far from it. But we're making really good progress in the area. But I'm afraid it's going to be another 20, 30 years before we really have the techniques perfected. But there's little question in my mind that in the future we will be able to take cells out of the body and manipulate them in the laboratory, then put the same cells back in and regenerate tissue that's healthy.
And in the meantime, these ventricular assist devices, they're not. It's not a whole heart. Kind of explain what that is to people. It just helps the heart, basically, right?
Sure. Well, a ventricular assist device is basically half of a total artificial heart. Now, your heart really has two parts. There's a right side and the left side of a heart. And the right side of the heart puts the blood through the lungs. The left side of the heart puts it through the rest of the body. And the left side of the heart's one that has to do most of the work. So the ventricular assist device just assists the left side of the heart, not the right side. So it's just half of a heart. And the left or ventricular assist device usually works probably in about 75% of the people. That's adequate because the left side of the heart is one that does the major work and has a strain on it. And if you can relieve that, it even makes the right side of the heart work better.
Talking to Dr. Laman Gray, who is with the University of Louisville. He's the chair in the Cardiothoracic Surgery Department, the endowed chair there. And we're talking about heart transplants and heart research and what's going on at the Cardiovascular Innovation Institute at UofL. I'm going to go for a couple more minutes here, and then we got to take a break. But one thing I want to ask you about the assist devices. How has the technology improved in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years with those, or are you still using the technology from 10 years ago in those?
No, actually it's improved dramatically. One of the big examples is the size of these assist devices. When we originally started to use them, they were so large they actually had to sit outside the body. Then we moved them into electrical motors where we were able to implant them, and it was actually implanted in the abdomen, and they were still quite large. And today, they're centrifugal pumps and axial flow pumps that really are about the size of a D-cell battery, as a good example. And so they're quite small, and even some of them are smaller than a D-cell battery that will totally fit inside the chest. And these are electrical type of devices, and so they're easier to implant. The patient doesn't bother the patient that much, and they're very efficient and work very, very well. So there's been dramatic improvement in the technology over the last 20 or 30 years.
Let me ask you this, and I forgot to ask a little bit earlier when we were talking about the heart assist devices. 3D printing. It's the wave of the future. They can make just about anything over in the Speed School of Engineering over here with these 3D printers. Is there going to be a time, you think, when we're going to be able to essentially manufacture a heart and stick it in somebody?
I doubt it, to be honest with you. There's certainly a lot of hype about that, but my gosh, the problems associated with it are staggering. It's not the 3D printing, and that's not the problem. That's, to be honest with you, that's sort of easy. The problem is getting the cells and the basic biology of cell biology, and it's truly just not realistic at this point in time. Now, we're doing 3D printing of cells at the CII, and it is an exciting area of research. And for instance, one thing we're doing with this is we're trying to make a patch that we can put on the heart to strengthen the muscle. And so what we do, we print a layer of cells, then we put a layer of cells that make vessels, then we put a layer of cell muscles, then we put more vessels. So yes, we do 3D printing making a structure, but it's not what most people conceive of making a heart by 3D printing.
Right, it's
So,
a little bit different. You might be able to make skin or something like that,
Absolutely.
but something as complex as a
Yes.
heart muscle, that's
it's
totally different story.
exactly.
All right, so give me some reason for optimism about research on hearts that we can go forward from here. What would you tell folks about the CII and just research in general about hearts?
Well, I personally think the future is absolutely one of the most exciting things. I'll be honest, I wish I were 30 years old and starting now instead of, unfortunately, at the end of my career, because I think there's a huge amount of exciting stuff, and it goes in many different ways. We're now doing these for cardiac surgery. We're doing these surgeries much better. We're using minimally invasive techniques. We use new, smaller incisions. We don't use the robot much in cardiac surgery, but I do think, looking in the future, yes, that will be used more in that. And the instruments we're using are much more sophisticated than when I started 30 years ago. And so I think the future looks just absolutely bright and really exciting. And again, I wish I were able to start over.
Guy, huh?
Yeah.
A young surgeon. All right, when you were a young surgeon, you were terrific, and you're still doing a great job now at the CII, and it's always great to talk to you, Dr. Laman Gray. Well, you may have heard, seen, or read something that Dewey Clayton has said. He's a UofL political science professor who's frequently interviewed on political races and Kentucky politics by the news media. But Dewey recently took a sabbatical to work on a couple of projects involving African Americans, social movements, and African American politics in North Carolina. And he's here to talk about that work on the sabbatical and what's going on in your world. Right, Dewey?
That's correct.
All right, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Mark.
All right, so you're back teaching this semester, right, at UofL. I got a couple classes.
That is correct.
When'd you take your sabbatical?
I took it last spring. Took it for a semester. We have an option of taking it paid for a semester and then unpaid for another. But I just took it for one.
Okay.
Just one semester. That's all I needed to do. That was good enough.
And you were working on the book about North Carolina politics at the time, right?
Right.
Aren't you from North Carolina?
I am from
That's
North
what I
Carolina,
thought.
starting to work on a book on North Carolina politics, specifically African Americans. And I say that because I've read numerous books and had professors that actually wrote several of those that look at North Carolina politics. They usually relegate African American politics to a sole chapter. And there's a story to be told that's more than a chapter there. And so I'm looking at going back from 1968 forward. And 1968 becomes a good year to do that because, as you probably well know, it wasn't until 1965 in many of the southern states that African Americans even got the right to vote in any significant numbers. They were still voting, but they were less than half in almost all the states. And so it wasn't until 1968 that you had a significant number of African Americans who began to actually rather than engage in voter registration, which many did from 1965 to 1968, you had three prominent African Americans in particular who ran for governor, a prominent dentist from Charlotte, North Carolina.
And that was 68, you said?
It was 1968. Reginald
You had
Hawkins.
a black guy running for governor in
Had a black guy
1968 in
running
North
for governor
Carolina.
in North Carolina.
Okay.
He probably knew he had no chance at all to win. But you've got to run. You've got to get out there. In fact, Charlotte, and as I'm researching, I'm finding these things out as well. Charlotte had, early on, had an African-American political machine going on there. And so it was quite natural that someone came out of that. And Hawkins had been very much involved in the desegregation efforts in the city of Charlotte and economic development and a lot of things like that, which is sort of continue to this day. And so Charlotte becomes a good place to look. Harvey Gantt, that name you may remember,
Yeah,
he was the
he's
first
governor.
Right, he was the first African American to attend Clemson, graduate from Clemson University, and he would go on to become the first black mayor of Charlotte. Subsequent to that, he was in two high-profile Senate races against a conservative from North Carolina, Jesse Helms.
I remember that well.
Right, so it's good sort of looking at that and interesting to look at that. I'm also looking at some people from North Carolina in the eastern part of the state. Dewey Clayton, for one, as an African-American female of all things, actually she ran for Congress from, I think it was the 2nd District in North Carolina back in 1968 as well. And she lost too, but she would continue on in politics in the state, and ultimately in 1992 she would run and she would be successful and then serve for 10 years. And there was one other gentleman by the name of Henry Fry who ran for the state legislature from Greensboro, and he served a couple of terms, and subsequent to that, he was appointed to the state Supreme Court and was ultimately appointed as Chief Justice, the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court in North Carolina, and then to serve as Chief Justice as well. So those are three main stories I want to tell, but there are others to tell, just the sort of politics that went on, the sort of get out the vote efforts, the sort of racialized campaigns that many of them had to contend with back in those days. But it's a very interesting story.
We're talking with Dewey Clayton, who's a political science professor at the University of Louisville, and we're talking about his work on working on a book about North Carolina African American politics. And we're going to talk in just a second about the civil rights movement in the 1960s and comparing that to Black Lives Matter, which you've also looked at. But as we go back to 1968 in North Carolina politics, what happened, and how can you compare what happened in North Carolina in 68 in African American politics with the rest of the South? Or was there anything similar in North Carolina and Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky?
In 1968, I don't know if there was that much similar in many other states. I do know that states were beginning, African Americans, there had been a concerted national effort. In other words, during the civil rights movement, the Kennedy administration had decided early on that maybe voter registration would be something to pour money into. In other words, you had SNCC students, CORE, you had a lot of young people in the streets throughout America, and they felt that maybe it would be a good thing to do to direct money towards voter registration drives and get African Americans involved in that. And that would also cut down on some of the violence in the streets as such. And so in North Carolina, as well as many other southern states, you had a concerted effort to pour money into voter registration drives. In fact, Vernon Jordan, who was a advisor to President Clinton and has been in politics for some time now, he was actually head of the voter education project in the southern region, which included North Carolina. And one of the reasons that some of these candidates even ran was because at a meeting that they had once, he was looking for some people to actually run. And Dewey Clayton tells the story about how he was looking for some good men to run, and none of them stepped forward, so she stepped forward and actually ran. So I would suspect that these efforts were going on in states all around the South. How successful many of them were in that early, I'm not necessarily sure.
Yeah, well, I remember Senator Georgia Powers, everybody talks about her here in the state of Kentucky running for the state Senate and winning, and an African-American woman, but I think that was it was in the 70s, the late 70s, I think, maybe even in the 80s before she won her race. So
No, she ran, I think it was 67.
Was it 67?
I believe it was 67
it was early 70s.
when she first ran, but you're right.
But was it for a state Senate seat or was it something else?
No, she ran she was
First
elected
time,
to the state Senate.
Okay, so Kentucky was right in there then with North Carolina. So North Carolina wasn't necessarily a trendsetter.
No, not necessarily.
In 68. So there was happening in other states across the South where you had some black candidates running for public office.
Sure, but you must remember, too, when African Americans en masse in the South first had the opportunity to vote, it's going to take time, and it will always take time when a group first gets the right to vote, as far as the political sophistication and maturity that it takes. In other words, being able to sort of let people learn the process of coming together and learning about the issues and mobilizing, into a cadre so that they can be an effective vote. That takes time, but it happened in Charlotte. It also happened in Durham, North Carolina, and so they've also had a strong African American sort of political community for some time now, and have learned to put up candidates over the years, some successful, some not so successful. I think of Henry McKinley Mashaw, who's one who was in the state legislature for many, many years. He made an early bid for Congress as early as 1982, and he ran against a gentleman from eastern North Carolina because L.H. Fountain, who had held that seat for many, many years, had retired. There was an open seat. He ran for it and actually won. Well, I should shouldn't say he won, but he received a majority of, not a majority, my words are wrong here. He received a plurality of the vote. But at the time, the election law there was that you had to win a simple majority. If no candidate won a simple majority, then there was a runoff election. And that actually disadvantaged many African Americans, because in that particular race, Michelle won 44% of the vote.
But you probably had two other white candidates in there.
Two other white
split the
candidates,
vote.
exactly,
Yeah.
and then they split the vote. And then in the runoff election, the third white candidate's support would go to, exactly. So they've actually changed that law in most states now, and so a plurality is enough to win.
Right. Again, we're talking with Dewey Clayton, a political science professor at the University of Louisville. I want to switch gears a little bit, sort of, and talk about the civil rights movement and how that compares to the Black Lives Matter movement. You've done a little bit of studying on this, so what do you think? How does it compare?
Well, it compares. There are a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences. Some of the similarities are that you've got young people involved. In my particular article that I just wrote, which actually just was accepted for publication, so I'm happy to hear that, I look particularly at 1961 and 1962. Those were two pivotal years in the civil rights movement. I'm sorry, 1960 and 1961. In 1960, that's when you had the sit-ins, and in 1961, that's when you had the freedom rides. And I've compared that with Black Lives Matter, in particular 2014 and 2015, because that's when you've had a lot of activity. Michael Brown, his killing was in 2014, and then in 2015, you had Fred Gray in Baltimore, and you also had protests and riots and whatnot going on. So I've compared the two, looking at various things like their messaging, whether it was inclusive or exclusive. I've also looked at their leadership styles. I've also looked at their issue framing and looked at how the media actually sort of presented both of them. And I found that in many respects, they were very different. For instance, if you look at leadership styles, the civil rights movement was clearly a top-down hierarchical style of leadership.
And Martin Luther King
Martin
Jr.,
King
Carmichael.
Right,
some of
exactly.
those
So you
guys.
had Dr. King at the top, and you did have others, but it wasn't primarily grassroots as such. It was all male-oriented, and the Black Lives Matter movement is completely different. There are three women that actually are the founders of the movement, and they clearly are not top-down. They don't want to be top-down. They're very grassroots, bottom-up, and so their approach is totally different. They want people to organize and sort of lead for themselves as such, and so that's completely different. And also in looking at messaging, exclusive and inclusive, this is something I found that the civil rights movement was very adept at. If you look at a lot of their slogans, a lot of their movements, for instance, SNCC itself, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, their symbol was a black and white hand clasp.
I remember that.
And when they started having sit-ins, that was one of the sort of very intriguing things about the sit-ins and SNCC.
So they were trying to be inclusive.
They
were
were
trying to
being
pull
inclusive.
in white supporters.
And they were
basically.
pulling in white supporters. The first sit-ins that happened February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. There were 4 African-American students at North Carolina A&T College. They sat in at a Woolworths on Elm Street. The day after that, some African-American females sat in with them from Bennett College, which was across the street, a predominantly female institution. But then 2 days later, white students from Greensboro College sat in with them. And so sit-ins spread all around the country. And as you probably well know, this was an exciting time in American history. The 60s was a time, it was a new decade. The opportunities appeared to be endless and boundless. And so their message was largely very much inclusive. And then framing, when you look at that, you look at the civil rights movement, they've had some problems framing their issues as such. For instance, when you
The
look...
civil rights movement or the Black Lives Matter
I'm sorry,
movement?
the Black Lives Matter
Yeah,
movement has had some
I would
problems.
agree with Black
So,
Lives
right,
Matter.
I'm sorry, my mistake. The civil rights movement really framed their issues. Dr. King was a... And
it was very clear.
Well, he was a master at being a master framer. What he was able to do, particularly when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, he was able to frame that using the words of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, basically by letting the country know that the civil rights movement stood for the principles that we were founded on: freedom, equality, justice, as such. And that was pivotal, because what that did is it put a lot of whites in this country who were sort of on the sidelines, regular people and politicians, and they saw the civil rights now as being a national issue, something
Right.
that they could identify with and come on board and support. However, Black Lives Matter has had some problems with that. For instance, as you well know, the police around this country have largely appropriated their language, and they now refer to themselves in a movement as Blue Lives Matter. And so it's become antagonistic. Now, Black Lives Matter, to be fair to them, they will argue that we're not saying blue lives don't matter, but Black Lives Matter is just saying that everyone else's lives have always mattered and ours have not. And so, but nonetheless,
they've lost control of the message and among some white folks by saying, by appearing to be anti-police. They say they aren't, but
exactly. Some people make that argument. Right. Exactly. So they've had a problem with their framing. They've also had a problem with their messaging as such. If you look at the civil rights movement, when they conducted the sit-ins, that was all purposeful. They had held workshops where they sat up straight. They were very proper. They dressed nicely. They spoke to people well. Black Lives Matter has been accused of going to rallies and just taking the microphone from the speakers, blocking highways. Roguish behavior. But in fairness to them, when you look back on the civil rights movement, a lot of what they did, their elders complained about their behavior as well. It's only in retrospect that you look back and you say that this behavior is really boorish as such. But right now, that's a problem they're having.
Only got about 90 seconds left here, Dewey, but I as an African-American male and a political science professor, I've got to ask you this question. African-American politics and power post-Obama. Where do we stand from your point of view right now in America?
Where do we stand? We stand at a period where, I'll be quite honest with you, there are a lot of ominous signs on the horizon. I know that Sadiqa Reynolds just delivered a wonderful essay about this.
The head of the Urban League.
Right, the head of the Urban League here on the state of Louisville, Black Louisville, and a lot of problems on the horizon here. If you look at, and statewide as well, if you look at the incarceration rate of African Americans, if you look at unemployment rate, if you look at housing problems, a lot of these problems have existed over a large period of time, though, and they festered, and we've not really dealt with them, so we're seeing what's happening now. What I'm concerned about is that the powers to be in Frankfurt now, as well as in Washington, seem to be wanting to reduce the role of government. And unfortunately, African Americans and many other minorities have always depended on government to often not just protect their civil rights, but also to provide necessary benefits and services that they need. So I'm really concerned with the shift here that a lot of African Americans are going to suffer even more.
But what I'm asking is, is there a bench full of African American politicians or leaders out there right now or not? Are they being marginalized like they were back in the 60s?
I think to a certain extent they are being marginalized. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, though, but I mean, for instance, you have a lot of African Americans who are serving in state legislatures around the South. However, and even here in Kentucky, however, most of them are in the minority party. And as you know how politics works, if you're in the minority, you have no power.
That's true.
So they, in essence, are a minority within a minority. Yeah. And that's difficult right now. Sure, they've got numbers. The Congressional Black Caucus nationwide is at about 48 or 49, which is the highest number it's ever been at, but if you look at their political power, it has been marginalized to a certain extent. So just the raw numbers don't mean a whole lot.
As you know, Dewey, I'm a political junkie, so it's always great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks for being on the program.
Sure.
All right, Did You Know segment for today. This is the little tidbit about the University of Louisville. So did you know World War II and the post-war era brought major changes to the University of Louisville. Shortly after the war, a movement began to close the all-black Louisville Municipal College and desegregate the university on all levels. That was accomplished in 1950 and 1951. So a little tidbit about the history of U of L right there, involving African Americans. That'll about do it for this edition of U of L Today with Mark Hebert, which you can hear every Monday and Tuesday night at 6 on 93.9 The Ville. You can also listen to the podcast of the shows on SoundCloud or watch the programs on Metro TV or KETKY throughout the week. Or you can just go to U of L's YouTube channel and find it anytime. Check out all the U of L news, videos, and events at UofLnews.com. That is UofLnews.com. Thanks for listening to U of L Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards!